I work in technology and mining. I've been there for 25 years, and there's a lot of talk at the moment how technologically advanced we are. So I wanted to raise the question in regards to renewables. Who's further down the path of renewables, the mining industry or the Catholic Church? It's actually the Catholic Church. They're doing a lot of things that we're going to talk about today as part of their program. And one of the things that I think is really important about why they're successful is they have very strong leadership that can mandate what the requirements are, and they have the will to do it. And we've heard a lot about the transactions of how you make these things happen, but I think will's a really strong requirement for getting these things across the line. My first job was actually in the Newman power station, the diesel power station that used to be on site, that eventually got replaced with a gas power station. And I'd love to see the case where my children don't have to work in an environment like that. And I remember the smell. It had a really dirty, horrible smell associated with it. So I care about this stuff, and that's why I surround myself with people that really know what they're talking about. So the challenges I think we have in this space is the questions aren't a transactional question of this versus this. Often we have to look at the system underlying the whole way that we work. And we want to talk about that today. Some of the technologies that add to this system and how you have to question the system in totality. Could you just flick one slide for me? Oh, thank you. So, 3 main points that we want to focus on. There's a policy imperative for this. There's a community will for this. People want this to occur. We've heard that already across this conference many times. The technology is available now. There's nothing stopping us doing this in mining. In fact, many other industries are doing it, and some of my peers in other technology areas, in other regions, are doing this already in areas that don't have the money that mining does as well. So I think we can do it right now. But the economic shift needs to be achieved through integrated systems designed and considering things in a different way. So I want to hand over to Adjunct Professor Neil Thompson. I love to surround myself with really intelligent and smart people, and that's why I'm talking with Neil. That's why I'm talking with Neil today, because it's the only way we make things happen. So I'll hand over to Neil, and I'll let him take you through some of the exciting technologies that he's been working through.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I do like lecterns, so I'll stay here. But yeah, I started life in a dirty coal-fired power station in Queensland called Swanbank. My father made me do that as my apprenticeship and did my engineering at night time. But as Matt said, look, we're involved with some interesting projects both in Australia and around the world. I guess one of the privileged positions is being an adjunct professor, which is an unpaid role. I basically get to see a lot of projects at the inception, and again, I like surrounding myself with engineers who actually get systems integration. I first came across hydrogen in the mid-90s. I was very lucky to be working with Northrop Grumman on stealth propulsion technology, and hydrazine is one of the derivative products that's used in that. If I say anything else, I'll be gunned down by the CIA. And then basically mid-sort of 2005, 2006, working in the automotive industry in Europe and seeing some of the really exciting stuff happening in hydrogen propulsion systems in cars and trucks and buses. And that's when I first met ITM Power and basically agreed to join their board earlier this year to really look at how we can use some of the lessons learnt in Europe, particularly in America, on how we can actually transition the industry here. And I guess, look, as Matt said, this is a policy imperative. I mean, I've got the privilege of working with governments both in Australia and overseas, in Canada, USA, Japan, Singapore, small Pacific nations, working on projects with Matt on island economies. Yeah, it's not an option. It's about transitioning to bioeconomies and using industrial ecology principles. And I'm very proud to say, having lived here for 3 years, basically I always use Kwinana as an example. I hear it talked about more at international conferences as a good example of how industrial ecology works. So basically, outputs from one system are feeding as inputs to another. And I guess that's the sort of engineering that we need, or we see we need in the mining industry to solve this vexing energy problem. And I guess, look, the reason I accepted the role to come back to Australia was really the policy and regulatory settings. We had Finkel's review of the national electricity market, which Lewis touched on, suggesting that renewables and hydrogen included plays a big part in the future of the national electricity market. But also CSIRO, positioning hydrogen as the export commodity of the future, really taking on the lead that Australia's had in iron ore, coal, LNG, and basically satisfying the demand of tiger economies, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and how do we actually get that offtake agreement signed with them before others do ahead of Australia. And also very pleased to be part of Hydrogen Mobility Australia, other members recognised here today, basically looking at how do we actually transition our local fleet, whether it's in the regions or in the cities, away from foreign oil. And basically it's a matter of energy security. Also working on military projects here in Australia, the same thing exists in the military. How do we actually make sure our tanks run on clean hydrogen that can be produced in the field, not an imported diesel which can be taken out, as we saw in the Battle of the Bulge in 39-45. So I guess the other good thing for the mining industry, there's certainly arenas here at the conference at looking at funding, grant funding for projects around renewables and hydrogen, but also the Clean Energy Finance Corporation working with the major banks and funding partners to look at low interest loans for projects that involve renewables and hydrogen. And I guess, yeah, don't take my word for it, certainly look to the Industry Association International Council on Mining and Metals. Plenty of case studies now looking at how renewables and hydrogen included plays a part in de-risking mining operations around the world. And I think the point was made yesterday by one of the delegates that we're seeing things happen in South Africa, Latin America, where basically they have no options on grid, whether it's coal or gas-fired. Basically they're jumping straight to renewables, including hydrogen. So we do have some catching up in some regards to do. I guess, yeah, the technology, I'm over the word pilot projects or trials, or all these technologies we're talking about today have a very high level of technological readiness. They're fundable now and they're insurable now, which is often a point that's missed by some of the project proponents. So the big picture in Europe, and particularly in Germany, is using spill renewable energy from solar plant or wind farms to actually create hydrogen whilst we have the renewable resource available. And the good thing about that is, like Australia, we have a large gas network, which I think was pointed out at another conference earlier this year, that the Australian gas network represents the energy storage capacity of 6.5 billion Tesla Powerwalls. So we already have a lot of assets here in Australia as a society that we can actually inject hydrogen gas using renewables, wastewater, rainwater, what have you, basically to decarbonise the gas network and also provide increased energy security and also deal with the rising gas prices we've seen, particularly in the East Coast market. The other big issues we're working with at the moment, it's not just the cars, it's actually buses. It's municipal buses in UK, Germany, France, basically around class actions over diesel particulates and even gas particulates, looking at how do we actually avoid, as a local government, being sued by our citizens over the demonstrated health impacts of some of these fossil fuels. So the big bus fleets we're working with, the UK double-decker buses, for example, are transitioning. We've had certainly projects put forward in Australia, and ironically, a lot of these buses, the heat testing trials was conducted here in Perth in the mid sort of 2000s. So it's ironic that some of these projects will eventually come back home based on the good work that was done in Perth in that period. But also the humble fork truck. I attended the launch with my HMA colleagues of the Heister Yale fork truck using the Nevera fuel cells in Sydney recently, and yeah, it potentially unlocks the huge roof areas for solar on distribution centres around Australia and has a material impact on productivity. I can do 3 times as much with a fuel cell fork truck as I can with an electric fork truck. And certainly, as I said, the cars are part of the equation as well, starting to see companies like Hyundai making noises about releasing their fuel cell Nexo vehicle here in Australia, and working with partners like Shell, BP and others. Caltex are all members of the Viva Energy, members of the Hydrogen Mobility Australia. How do we actually introduce hydrogen onto forecourt? And I guess we're always asked the question about electric vehicles versus fuel cell electric vehicles. The answer is this is not about VHS versus beta. This is just how diesel and petrol have coexisted. So does electric and hydrogen. And Shell, for example, in Europe, have just bought a company called New Motion. They have 30,000 recharging points in Europe, and they're putting those into the service stations as well. So this is a case of coexisting together and looking at urban mobility as well as long haul. I guess in the mining industry itself, I referred to ICMM earlier. There's some fantastic case studies happening at the moment around underground low loaders, prime movers, mining camps. Again, and a lot of this is happening in South Africa and Latin America. So there's plenty of case studies and plenty of site visits available for conferences to attend, to really have a look at how miners have employed renewables and hydrogen in these applications for stationary power and motive power. And that's part of the key in working with Matt, is we look at both. That's part of the strategy to get a 1 + 1 = 3 outcome in terms of economics and also emissions. So I guess, look, the pathway we see is for existing mining facilities in Australia, what land capabilities we got for putting in renewable assets. There's plenty of people outside who can help you with that, whether it's solar or wind. And secondly, looking at what water resources we have. I was talking to one of the gentlemen yesterday at lunch from Adelaide, and they've got plenty of water from the Murray River. They've got water rights, but they've also got rainfall, and I've spent a lot of time in Queensland dewatering mines. So we don't really have a shortage of feedstock. It's really a case of working out what you've got as renewable assets, and I think, like Matt said, using natural capital as per the Catholic Church's edict, and basically seeing what percentage of baseload I can actually provide both to my stationary operations, but also to my fleet as a clean fuel. So that's for existing operations, and I guess I'd probably like Matt to have a bit of a chat about what we could envisage for new operations where we actually have the opportunity to influence design from day one. And again, don't take my word for it. Everyone's complaining about, I think one of the gentlemen yesterday said that in some constituencies, energy, both stationary and motive, is 5%. Others have said it's 15 to 20%. So either way, we're under pressure on profitability for both motive and stationary energy. Working in the UK with funders like Lazard, again, they provide some fantastic independent reports on levelized cost of energy, which can really help to guide people through the sort of minefield of sort of conflicting information around LCOE. 30 to 50% is doable depending on the location and the natural assets that you've got available. So I might hand back to Matt to have a look at the mine of the future.
Sure. I'm an electrical engineer by profession, power systems, and I've been on projects and various jobs across the last 25 years. And one of the things that happens with electrical engineering is it happens late. And we do technology even probably later than that. So when you talk about innovation and progression in this space, you've got to take it back to the start of a project. By the time we see a project, we've already defined what the project is, the WBS structure, the organisational structure, and how it all works. My view on life is you have to go back and really question that fundamental. So to question a fundamental of a project, you have to have a vision of what you want the project to do. So I want to talk about mining camps. They're very dear to my heart. I spent about a decade in them. I did over 8 years FIFO, and they've varied in quality a lot over the years. I was just really happy when you had your own ablution block that you didn't have to go share with some other miners. But there's a long way they could go as well. And when we look at our peers in other industries, like the hotel industry, the island industry, they try and look at their whole area as a biosphere, this industrial ecology idea of this is something precious to me, we need to take care of it. And so if you start to look at that, we've got to question the fundamentals. Often when you'd look at a camp in a normal structure, you'd say, how do I replace that diesel gen set with a solar panel? And that's pretty much where it goes. But I'd ask the question, what if we could rip down the power lines? What if we could take out the diesel? And what if we could replace the whole diesel infrastructure for the transport to the people to and from site? Then it creates a fundamentally different way of looking at it. And people will say, well, that's too hard at the moment. But I think from some of the things that Neil's just said, these technologies are there now. So as an example, Neil, if you could give me another. So some of the opportunities that are there. And a gentleman mentioned the other day, we shouldn't raise a bridge, we should lower the river. Well, this is a combination of those types of things. So geothermal air conditioning, heating and cooling, that's commonplace in many of our other industries. I've even heard it talked about in residential. So if a residential unit could afford to do that, then I'm sure there's a big place for that. The application of hydrogen microturbines, taking stored hydrogen power and having a microturbine, and what was the size they started?
65 kilowatts.
65 kilowatts. So they're of a scale that makes sense for something like a mining camp, and they can scale up from there into the megawatts. That's a great backup to replace your diesel genset. The camps could have gas in the kitchens. I think it's slightly ironic that some of the things we're talking about in regards to distributed hydrogen gas and electric vehicles were some of the first inventions around about 100 years ago in this space, and they've lost interest and they're all coming back again. Rooftop solar obviously is a one that's should be obvious, but many mining camps wouldn't utilise their roof space for that necessity. Even the way we design the camp buildings themselves should be questioned. There's a massive push in the mining industry over the last period of time to modularise everything. But the problem with modularising camp buildings is if you put 300 of them on site, you have 300 trucks, and most of those trucks are full of air. So maybe there's a different way to build where you don't actually have to send 300 trucks up into the Pilbara. Maybe you can flat pack them in another way and send less trucks. And look at that whole life cycle associated with those. Biogas is another interesting one. Now, the scale of the effluent on a mine site might not be enough to put an individual biogas facility in, but it can append to the hydrogen microturbines as well. So rather than wasting that potential energy source, let's take that and use it, but only in a systems context with the hydrogen as well. So when you start to add all of these things in, you can have a camp that has no power line, no diesel coming into it at all. And one of the big things we've heard in the last couple of days is motive force. You know, that's the last bastion of mining, is how do we do the motive force? The hydrogen buses that are available right now, I imagine a place in a mining camp. The traditions of a mining camp is everyone wants their own car, right? And it's a status symbol, it's a convenience item, and you end up with these masses of cars on construction projects, these masses of cars on mining projects. In doing so, you need all of the infrastructure, you need the vehicles, you need the fuel, you need the bigger car parks, all of the facilities that come with that, the lighting. What if you could have an autonomous bus that just goes back and forward? Because some of the excuses, there's plenty of excuses in mining. I know, I live there, I've operated mine sites. There's lots of excuses of why we can't do things and why I need special treatment. But imagine if we could just pull up an app and say, I need to get to site now. I've had a call out. I don't have to have my individual car. You could just have 2 buses or a number of buses going back and forth, no vehicles except maybe at the facilities on site, call them autonomously. I'm pretty sure we could automate a bus going back and forward to one line down into a camp, to the mine site, if we can automate the trucks. So get rid of the cars. Don't have them at all. And then once you have the hydrogen fuel capacity, then you can start using it for things like the trucks on site, the forklifts and those other things. But the way we get to these things is we have to start thinking about them from the core level up. Stop thinking about how I take something I've done before, replicate it and innovate it slightly. We've been subject to that many times when someone presents me with a project and say, show me how to innovate it. And I said, well, how to innovate it? You start again from the start and redo some of the fundamental questions about how we're going to run this thing. So that's where I think the opportunity is in this space. So, in summary, the change in process changes the whole loop of how we look at everything. So for me, the system inputs to something like a camp should be solar, geothermal. Obviously, you need some food and goods. We have storage, battery and hydrogen. They're quite capable. Battery for short-term storage, hydrogen for pretty much as much long-term storage as you care to put in there. And then we use the fuel cell or electric vehicles, and we optimise the camp. We use the organic and inorganic waste, and we overall we don't have a complete biosphere yet, but it's a hell of a lot better than what we have today. So, in summary, the industry needs to drive this change. I've met a lot of people in the last couple of days that are really passionate about this in different areas, but there's certain people in the audience that have the political clout and the will and the desire to do this. My team's been fortunate enough to be on the front of a lot of leading edge technologies in Perth and in WA, including, you know, the 2 big remote operations centres, autonomous haulage. You know, now we're at the forefront of LTE implementation inside the mining industry. The thing that makes all of these things work is someone in a mining industry that cares enough to want it to happen, not irrespective of the economics, but the economics are a secondary factor in regards to actually making the change and trialling some of these things out. So we need to drive the change. The industry precedents are there. We try and reinvent everything ourselves a lot of the time. We get teams involved, we overcomplicate things. There's a lot of things we can just grab and use tomorrow and really just put in there. Go have a look at some of these other industries, maybe have a look at what the Catholic Church is doing. That could be an exciting thing for you. But we need to have a systems thinking approach. I think we lack a systems thinking approach in much of our industries. We've commoditised functions, we've commoditized people, we've turned things into transactions rather than looking at the whole and the holistic entity that is a mine site and everything associated with it. So that's what we try and bring to bear when talking with people like Neil. We seek out the best technologies to do that, and I encourage you to maybe have a rethink about how we look at projects and have a relook at hydrogen. Like, there's I get excited every so often about technologies, and there's a lot I see every day that I go, meh. But, hydrogen is one I think is a game changer over the long term. Hopefully I'm not standing here in 5 years' time and you've all proved me wrong, but I think it's worth taking a risk at and an investment in. And we're pretty excited about working with Neil and his team. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.